Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the overwhelming noise of history and research, cut through it, and give you the essential, unforgettable knowledge. Today, we're starting at a moment of, well, almost unimaginable glory. It's Red Square, Moscow, in the triumphant summer of 1945.
Is the absolute zenith of Soviet power. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, the euphoria in the air. The war against Nazism is finally over.
And the scene itself is just so deliberately crafted. It's meant to evoke this sense of ancient power, almost like a Roman triumph.
Absolutely. You have these victorious soldiers marching across the square, and they're not just celebrating, they're performing a ritual. They are throwing these vanquished Nazi flags down, literally casting the evil of Hitler at the feet of the ultimate winner, Generalissimo Joseph Stalin.
He is a figure of pure myth in that moment, and not just in the Soviet Union, but globally. Our sources describe this period using language that is almost religious.
It borders on worship. There's one poet who wrote, "Stalin, you are higher than the high celestial spaces, and only your thoughts are greater than you. Your spirit, Stalin, is brighter than the sun."
And to the rest of the world, he's the symbol of resistance. He's the architect of victory, this small father of the people who promises a fairer, happier society for everyone.
And that celestial image, that blinding light of victory, is precisely what we need to penetrate today. Because the source material immediately draws the starkest possible contrast.
Right.
The man who was being idolized by millions was, at the same time, one of history's greatest criminals. He wielded this unlimited brutality against the very people he claimed to be leading.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's get into the reality behind the myth. If we look at the core historical claims that the sources provide, what does the Soviet system under Stalin actually look like?
The facts are, they're staggering and they're devastating. Forget the external war for a moment. We need to focus on the internal war he waged against his own citizens.
Yeah.
We are looking at the forced labor system known as the Gulag. This system ultimately enslaved up to 18 million people. And many of them were just citizens, not soldiers, all under the cynical pretense of preserving the state from disease and infection.
And it doesn't stop there.
Not even close. The sources confirm he cynically engineered famines, particularly the one in Ukraine, which resulted in an estimated 7 million deaths. And perhaps the most chilling part is how he sacrificed even his own immediate family to his lust for power. He stated at one point, "A true Bolshevik shouldn't have a family."
That's a critical psychological insight right there.
Yep.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that trajectory. How did Yosef Jugashvili, the son of a small craftsman, go from being, as the sources put it, an insignificant character in the early Bolshevik movement into this deadly dictator who promised an absolute utopia but delivered, well, unprecedented and relentless terror?
It's the journey from the periphery to the dead center of absolute darkness. And that transition begins right at the start of the revolutionary structure.
And that's the core mystery we really need to solve. How does the man who seemed like a political afterthought end up with absolute, unchallengeable power? Let's begin our deep dive into part one. From insignificant character to absolute power. So our starting point has to be 1924. Lenin, the leader of the revolution, is dead. Stalin, who is 46 years old at the time, is the Secretary General of the Communist Party.
And the sources are completely unified on this point. This was seen as a managerial, administrative role, a relatively erased post. Absolutely no one saw him as a natural successor to Lenin.
It really is one of the great historical blind spots, isn't it?
It truly is. When Lenin died, you had these intellectual giants like Trotsky, the brilliant orator, the theoretician, the charismatic military commander. He seemed like the obvious contender.
And Stalin, meanwhile, is literally carrying Lenin's coffin. It's one of the few times he's even at the center of the political stage.
And his comrades just utterly underestimated him. We have direct quotes from the time. One comrade dismissed him as the most outstanding mediocrity of our party. Another one confidently said, "We are not afraid of Stalin. As soon as he will want to get on his high horse, we will eliminate him."
They just saw him as a functionary, someone easy to manipulate or, just get rid of when the time came.
Exactly. The perfect bureaucrat.
Ah.
But they thought he was a functionary, and he weaponized that function.
How did that happen? How did this seemingly dull administrative role give him such a decisive edge over all these revolutionary intellectuals?
Well, he used the role of Secretary General to gain control over the party's actual infrastructure. And that turned out to be far more powerful than debating theory with Trotsky in public.
So he was working behind the scenes.
Completely. He controlled the appointments to all the regional party offices, the disciplinary committees, the funding for local cadres. He was quietly building this loyal network of apparatchiks who owed him everything: their jobs, their power, and eventually their lives.
So while Trotsky is writing these brilliant articles,
Stalin is installing his people everywhere. He was effectively rigging the internal political game. Nobody even saw the shift until it was far too late.
before we get to the actual seizure of power, let's just briefly touch on the man's roots. It helps to understand this iron determination he had.
Yosef Tukishvili was born in 1878 into abject poverty. His father was an abusive shoemaker, often drunk, and his childhood was marked by a lot of violence.
And he had a religious background, didn't he?
He did, which is fascinating. He spent a brief period growing up with Orthodox monks and even studied at a Tiflis seminary before he was expelled for revolutionary activity. He joined the fight against the Tsar early on, engaged in bank robberies for the Bolshevik cause, and adopted the name Stalin.
Which means the man of steel.
Exactly. And that moniker wasn't given to him. He chose it for himself. It was a projection of the iron will and the cold persona he felt he needed to succeed.
And that iron will, it manifested in a stunningly swift seizure of power. He leveraged that political machine he'd built to rule out Trotsky, first domestically, and then eventually exiling him to Kazakhstan.
He was a political masterclass, really, achieved through these incremental internal defeats for his rivals. He played different factions against each other. He used Zinoviev and Kamenev to sideline Trotsky, and then, of course, he turned on them later.
And by the late ones, the result was just shocking to everyone.
Nobody saw it coming. But Stalin had consolidated all the power, and then he moves into the Kremlin citadel, the former palace of the Tsars. That move is so profoundly symbolic of his new, almost royal power. He wouldn't leave that base for 3 decades.
That move from political obscurity to occupying the seat of the Tsars, it signals that he wasn't just continuing Lenin's work. He was starting his own radical project, ready to go far beyond the original revolution.
His determination was absolute. His worldview is totally deterministic and hierarchical. He believed that Bolsheviks were a special breed, the only ones truly capable of building the future.
And he had that famous declaration.
The others have no value. They are not worth a dime. He saw his mission as total transformation, and this required what he called a clean slate, wiping out anything that even smacked of old Russia.
What did that cultural wiping out actually involve in those early years?
It was a direct assault on history and tradition. The revolution had been somewhat ambivalent about religion, but Stalin ended that ambiguity. He passed a decree that explicitly declared religion was against the interests of the people.
Which led to mass destruction.
Yes, the systematic destruction of ancient Orthodox icons and churches across the entire country. And in place of that old order, he promised the ultimate communist ideal: a happy, healthy society without rich or poor, where education, health, all resources were universally shared and accessible to everyone. It was the purest utopian vision you could sell to the masses.
And that utopian vision was based on this impossible goal: rapid, total modernization.
Yes. Stalin was obsessed with Russia's historical failure to modernize quickly enough. He believed it had always led to defeat. He warned, old Russia has always been defeated because of its delay, and then he added this chilling thought: the stragglers will be defeated.
His solution was the first 5-year plan.
A brutal, full-speed industrial drive. He launched these gigantic construction sites: the Moscow subway, huge hydroelectric dams, massive steel plants like Magnitogorsk, new railways, towering skyscrapers. The goal was to transform the country into a paradise for workers overnight, a place where unemployment was conceptually impossible.
And as this massive societal transformation is happening, he's simultaneously engineering the very image of his own power. This is the start of the cult of personality.
This is a crucial pivot point. He realized the real man could never sustain the myth he needed. So his portrait began appearing everywhere, on every factory wall, on every train compartment, in every classroom, every dining room.
And our sources confirm he was personally involved in crafting this image.
Deeply involved. He personally scrutinized and corrected his own official biography, which was distributed in millions of copies. In his own handwriting, he added this crucial self-aggrandizing line: Stalin is the greatest captain of all times and people. He was literally writing his own scripture.
The contrast between that grandiose self-image and the physical reality of the man is just so striking, and it explains why he had to be so obsessive about controlling the narrative.
Exactly. The man hailed as a titan was, in reality, only about 5'3" tall. To compensate, he routinely wore wedge heel shoes, and often a small wooden plate was placed under his feet when he was photographed with taller deputies.
And the pockmarked skin.
From surviving smallpox at age 7. It was routinely touched up or just obscured in public photos, to present this image of, pristine skin. He was secretive, deliberately inaccessible, locking himself in his office and meticulously hiding his private life. This cultivated mystery was a calculated tool of power. It ensured the myth always overshadowed the man.
And the rare glimpses we do get into that private life, especially in the early years, are just profoundly disturbing. The sources detail these gatherings with his deputies, singing and joking on the Black Sea coast, but always with this underlying coldness. This leads us right into part 2, disappointment, personal tragedy, and the scapegoat strategy.
Those ambitious utopian projects, while they were producing impressive steel and power plants, they failed catastrophically where it mattered most, the daily lives of Soviet citizens. By the early 1930s, the bad news was just overwhelming.
Stalin's focus on heavy industry meant consumer goods and housing were completely sacrificed.
Exactly. And what did that failure look like on the ground? It was squalor, it was desperation. The Russian population was booming, but virtually no new residential housing was being built.
So families were forced into these communal apartments, the communality?
Yes, where multiple families would share tiny spaces, kitchens, bathrooms. The standard of living just plummeted, and food shortages became the norm, not the exception.
You mentioned there's this rare clandestine documentation that contradicts the propaganda of abundance. What did that footage recorded by Lady Mountbatten in Moscow actually reveal?
It was powerful, undeniable evidence of the collapse. Mountbatten recorded these signs of severe poverty and visible malnutrition in the capital itself. She noted the horrifying sight of people, including former teachers, even aristocrats from the Tsarist era, rummaging through garbage bins for scraps.
And the empty stores?
Empty stores, and the lines, the infamous ochred, were endless. People would queue all day, often in vain, just for the most meager supplies. It was the dark, visible reality that directly contradicted every single poster promoting the workers' paradise.
So if the reality was so visibly grim, how did Stalin intellectually reconcile this failure? Did he ever consider adjusting the ambitious 5-year plans?
Never. For Stalin, the system he had designed was inherently perfect. Therefore, the failure could not possibly be the fault of the policy. It had to be the result of malicious internal resistance.
Sabotage.
Exactly. He insisted the system was being actively sabotaged by unseen enemies. And this allowed him to immediately pivot to a strategy of hunting down culprits among economic officials, engineers, and scientists.
This sounds like the beginning of institutionalized terror. It starts with that infamous anecdote about the financial desk, Brukhanov.
It really illustrates the transition from political maneuvering to this personal, cynical sadism. Brukhanov was just a financial officer whom Stalin deemed incompetent. A collaborator drew a satirical sketch of the man, and Stalin wrote this chilling, detailed instruction in the margin of the drawing.
What did it say?
It said, "For all his sins past and present, hang Brukhanov from the testicles. If they hold up, consider it acquitted by the court. If they give up, throw them in the river." The source emphasizes he was only half joking.
Wow.
The message was crystal clear. Even administrative inconvenience could merit horrific personal punishment.
And this casual cruelty soon becomes codified through the political show trials. These laid the legal groundwork for the Great Terror that was to come.
Absolutely. The first major one was the Shakti trial in 1928, quickly followed by the Industrial Party trial in 1930. These were designed to officially identify the enemies responsible for the slow economy.
And they targeted highly competent people.
Yes, non-party scientists and engineers, accusing them of being spies or counter-revolutionaries working for foreign powers to sabotage Soviet industry. Stalin appointed his ruthless chief prosecutor, Judge Andrei Vyshinsky, a man who understood the proceedings were just theater, ending in a predetermined death sentence.
And to sell this theater to the Soviet public and to the skeptical outside world, the defendants had to convincingly play their roles, didn't they?
They did. They were subjected to weeks, sometimes months, of brutal physical and psychological torture at the Lubyanka, the secret police headquarters. The goal wasn't just physical pain, but the complete breaking of the spirit.
Until they would confess in open court.
Yes, until they would stand there and recite these chilling prepared confessions declaring, "I deserve the worst punishment." Now, the final verdict was often commuted to 10 years in prison, a propaganda gesture to appear merciful. But the crushing message was sent. Opposition is not tolerated, and we can make anyone confess to absolutely anything.
This coldness, it extended directly into his home life, most notably in his relationship with his eldest son, Yakov.
The relationship was notoriously bitter. Yakov, who was struggling under his father's expectations, attempted suicide. Instead of showing any parental concern, Stalin's reaction was one of complete and utter scorn.
He mocked him.
He mocked his own son, declaring Yakov couldn't even shoot on target. This anecdote just perfectly encapsulates the required lack of humanity for the true Bolshevik, a man capable of sacrificing his own blood without a moment's hesitation.
That internal fracture, it reaches its absolute peak with the suicide of his wife, Nadezhda. This is arguably the great personal tragedy that precipitated the shift to widespread systemic mass murder.
Nadezhda Alilieva, who was 22 years his junior, was fragile and often suffered from his temper and frequent verbal abuse. Their relationship had deteriorated into this constant tension, especially as she became more aware of the increasing brutality of his policies.
And their final quarrel was at an official reception.
In the Kremlin in 1932, she reportedly exploded, calling him an executioner who was tormenting the Russian people. She left the room, went back to her apartment, and committed suicide with a single revolver bullet to the heart.
And the party immediately covered up the truth, turning a tragic event into a state lie.
Of course, the official announcement was death by appendicitis. Suicide was considered an act of political treason in the Soviet state, and they could not risk damaging the leader's image.
Even her friends condemned her.
Even her close friend, Polina Molotov, condemned Nadezhda, arguing that she had abandoned Stalin during such a difficult period for the country. But the internal effect on Stalin was profound. At her funeral, he was devastated, calling her an enemy who had ruined my life and left him a cripple.
And the sources are clear on this point.
Yes. Before Nadezhda's death, he was brutal. After this emotional trauma, he became utterly politically merciless.
This psychological shift from brutal to merciless is the foundation of Part 3, terror as policy, famine and forced labor. So his first post-Nadezhda target was the peasantry. They were resisting the forced collectivization policies, refusing to submit to the kolkhozes. For listeners, what exactly were these kolkhozes, and why did the peasants fight them so bitterly?
The kolkhozes were collective farms. They were essentially state-controlled cooperatives where peasants had to pool their land, their livestock, their tools, and relinquish all private ownership. For centuries, the Russian peasants' identity was tied to their land, and they resisted this forced transition violently.
So rather than hand over their property, they destroyed it.
Yes. Millions of peasants, who were dubbed kulaks or rich peasants by the party, slaughtered their own livestock. And Stalin's response wasn't reform, it was annihilation. He sent police officers into the countryside with the explicit mission to requisition crops, to literally seize the food needed for survival, intending to asphyxiate these resisting families.
And we have the chilling testimony of those who actually carried out these orders, like the policeman Lev Kopelev, who provided the internal justification for this brutality.
Kopelev admitted to participating in these terror expeditions. He described how they would probe the ground for hidden food stores, forcing themselves to ignore the children's tears and the moans from women. The moral justification was terrifyingly simple. For Kopelev and the party, everything was permissible. Destruction, lies, theft, because the end justified the means.
The universal triumph of communism.
That's right. It sanctioned the systematic destruction of any human life that stood in its path.
The direct, horrific result of this policy was the Holodomor in 1933, a famine concentrated in Ukraine, which was historically one of Europe's most fertile regions. This wasn't just a consequence of bad policy, was it?
No, the sources are unequivocal on this. This famine was known and even wanted by Stalin. Holodomor literally means death by starvation. To ensure resistance was crushed, Stalin issued orders for the state to seize not just the edible grain, but also the seed stock needed for the next year's planting.
And he trapped them there.
He imposed severe internal border blockades, preventing starving peasants from leaving their villages to search for food. When local party members protested, describing horrifying scenes like the report that a train full of corpses just arrived in Kyiv, Stalin ignored them completely. This calculated cruelty condemned an estimated 5 million people to death. Nearly half of them were children.
That level of intentional human suffering is staggering, and yet at the same time, Stalin was maintaining this facade of prosperity for the outside world, particularly during the visit of the French deputy Édouard Herriot.
Herriot's visit is the perfect illustration of stage-managed deception. He was invited by the Soviets to tour Ukraine, and when he returned, he issued this glowing report declaring, "I crossed Ukraine. I can assure you that I saw like a garden in full yield."
And he dismissed the famine reports.
Just shrugged them off, saying, "Allow me to shrug my shoulders."
So how is it possible for an experienced foreign politician to be so completely fooled?
The sources detailed the meticulous preparation. Before Harriet's train even arrived, streets were cleaned, buildings were painted, and the people he met were carefully vetted. The workers he spoke to were often just extras brought in for the performance. Food was displayed prominently in stores for the duration of his visit, only to be removed the second he left.
This manufactured reality was a structural component of the entire regime.
Absolutely. And this mandate for fabricating reality, it extended into all aspects of Soviet cultural life. It forced journalists and filmmakers to describe the world as it should be, not as it was.
So if harvest failed,
The media would publish victorious press releases with fake numbers and film radiant peasants celebrating abundance in magnificent fields. They invented industrial heroes like the miner Alexei Stakhanov, who was supposedly extracting 14 times the average amount of coal.
which was completely false.
The sources confirm it was a complete fabrication, a manufactured myth used by the party to set impossible, abusive targets for all other workers. Propaganda wasn't a decoration. It was state policy.
the ultimate physical manifestation of this controlled, unforgiving state was the Gulag machine. And this wasn't just about mass arrest. It was forced labor and mass deportation.
Stalin's agents were given quotas not just for arrest, but for deportation. Thousands of men, women, and children were packed into cattle wagons and transported across these vast distances. The journey itself was often a death sentence.
There's a survivor's account.
A child survivor recalled 7 people dying of starvation in a single wagon during the brutal transit. Upon arriving at remote sites like Tomsk, the surviving prisoners would have to unload the corpses, children, youths, old people, before being marched into the camps.
And the Gulag system itself, which was built before the German concentration camps became notorious, it really defined state control. Who were these millions of prisoners?
The term Gulag refers to the main state administration for corrective labor camps. And while officially they were holding enemies of the revolution, the prisoners were mostly ordinary citizens, religious people, or even notable figures who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time or failed to meet some impossible quota.
And they were all mixed together.
Yes, with common law criminals and used as disposable slaves in the far north. The conditions were horrific. Temperatures often dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. One prisoner described the terror of freezing. It's dangerous to start moving, and touching a metal tool with bare hands meant the risk of ripping your skin right off. Intellectuals and professionals were deliberately reduced to barely functioning scarecrows through endless back-breaking labor.
The White Sea Canal Project in 1933 really stands as the epitome of the system's cruelty and, well, its futility.
It connects the White Sea to the Baltic Sea. It's a massive 200-kilometer waterway that Stalin wanted built in record time, surpassing even the Panama Canal. But it was dug almost entirely by hand, with only pickaxes and shovels, by 300,000 Gulag prisoners.
It was an administrative disaster disguised as a triumph.
Completely. 30,000 prisoners died, roughly 1 in 10. And the ultimate irony of this massive human sacrifice. In their haste to meet Stalin's deadlines, the canal wasn't dug deep enough. It was rendered unusable by the vast majority of Soviet naval and commercial vessels. It's a monument to useless death.
And yet, despite the scale of this manufactured tragedy, many in the West remain blind, often just repeating the Soviet propaganda wholesale.
The level of foreign denial, or often enthusiastic support, is just astonishing. For instance, French newspapers reported that a notorious former Tsar's prison in Siberia was now being used for large rabbit breeding under the watch of a special scientific institute.
And foreign communists were intoxicated by the ideal.
Totally. The French writer Louis Aragon not only approved of the Gulag but publicly praised the system, calling the rehabilitation of man by man a unique historical moment akin to the transition from ape to man.
And this devotion extended beyond intellectuals. Maurice Thorez, the leader of the French Communist Party, called Stalin the greatest pilot in 1935. This blind devotion persisted even as Stalin's focus shifted from crushing the masses to eliminating those closest to him. Let's move to part 4. The Great Terror and Total Paranoia. So Stalin's political project was nearing completion, but now he had a new, more refined purpose: consolidating his absolute personal control by killing the entire generation of old Bolsheviks who still shaded him.
This was a conscious, systematic, and chillingly thorough purge. If you think back to Lenin's funeral in 1924 and look at the men who carried that coffin alongside Stalin, nearly all of them died by his order.
Kamenev and Zinoviev were executed.
Tomsky was driven to suicide. Rykov was shot. Reddick was murdered. This wasn't just political expediency. It was profound, calculated vengeance. The sources capture this philosophical approach. They quote Stalin saying, "Choose your victim, carefully prepare for the coup, relentlessly carry out your revenge, and then go to bed. There is nothing sweeter than this in the world."
That quote suggests not just ambition, but a personal enjoyment of the process of destruction. And this culminates in the attack on his closest partner for 15 years, Nikolai Bukharin, in 1938.
Bukharin was the last major intellectual rival, a man who had dared to contradict Stalin on ideological and economic issues. He was instantly marked as an enemy. The party propaganda machine went into overdrive, accusing him and his peers of being agents of capitalism, dogs of fascism.
And the public was whipped into a frenzy.
Public outrage was manufactured with calls like, "Death to these enemies, death to these parasites," all while Bukharin was being savagely tortured at the Lubyanka.
And he wrote a final, desperate letter to Stalin, pleading for his life.
It's one of the most heartbreaking documents of the Great Terror. Bukharin wrote to the man he had known and worked with for decades, imploring him to stop the trial, saying, "My heart bleeds at the thought that you may think that I am guilty. I beg you, in the name of everything you care about, not to allow me to get shot. I would like to take poison."
He was begging for a less humiliating death.
And this plea was utterly ignored. Bukharin was shot, and the erasure was total. His images were systematically removed from propaganda, and his entire family was deported.
By this point, Stalin was completely paranoid. He was seeing enemies everywhere, and he actively encouraged this culture of mass denunciation across the entire country.
The whistleblowing became a civic duty. It turned neighbor against neighbor, even children against parents. We have the widely reported example of the young pioneer boy who denounced his own father, stating he must be hard on his father's responsibility, not as a son, but as a pioneer.
And to manage this industrial scale of persecution, Stalin relied on Nikolai Yezhov.
The new head of the NKVD, the secret police. Yezhov was nicknamed the Dwarf because he was only 5'05" tall, but he boasted terrifyingly, "I might be short, but my hands are strong. These are Stalin's hands."
We know the purges were massive, but the sources discuss a Great Terror administered by Yezhov in 1937. How did they handle the logistics of such widespread murder? Did they actually set specific numerical targets?
They absolutely did. And this is one of the most terrifying administrative revelations in the source material. The existence of execution quotas. We have documents detailing the system. A terrifying chart lists the name of a republic like Azerbaijan, followed by 3 columns. Figures for first category, immediate execution, figures for second category, deportation to the Gulag, and a total.
So party officials were just tasked with finding people to fill those numbers.
Any people. It turned the entire justice system into an arbitrary mathematical calculation, a quota for death.
It's just fear maximized.
Precisely. You can consider a random example pulled from the archives. A man named Silarov, with a small house and some livestock, was indicted for simply saying, "Stalin killed a lot of people." The verdict, shoot Silarov. The randomness was the point. If the innocent could be condemned based on a quota, then nobody was safe.
And the scale was immense.
Yezhov was responsible for shooting an average of 1,000 people per day in 1937. His operational mantra was chillingly efficient. Strike, exterminate without sorting. It's better to go too far than not far enough.
It's hard to reconcile this mass execution with the continuation of normal life in Moscow. How did Soviet society maintain a veneer of culture amidst this level of terror?
It was a cognitive dissonance that was cultivated by the state. Tchaikovsky's beautiful ballet, Swan Lake, which was Stalin's favorite, was played nightly at the Bolshoi Theater. The man responsible for signing death warrants would sometimes attend the ballet and then return to the Kremlin to review and sign execution orders prepared for him.
And he would add his own comments.
Handwritten, sadistic feedback to the files, such as, "Tighten the screw on this gentleman, beat him again and again." The terror operated right alongside the pretense of civilization.
The terror, however, inevitably devours its own. Yezhov, the ultimate executioner, eventually became a victim himself.
By 1938, Yezhov's usefulness had passed. Stalin, ever cautious, blamed Yezhov for going too far and accused him of treason. He was tortured, executed, and, in a final act of symbolism, physically erased from all official photographs.
So Stalin had eliminated every threat.
Every political and administrative threat. He replaced the old guard with the nomenklatura, a new generation of party activists who owed him everything. And critically, this class benefited directly from the purges, inheriting the apartments, the cars, the political positions of the victims. They were a powerful, protected, administrative ruling class whose entire existence depended solely on Stalin's continuation in power. He now had total, undisputed control.
But the horizon was darkening with an external threat. And we transition now to Part 5, the global conflict and the price of victory. So by the late 1930s, Hitler had been in power for 5 years. He'd openly laid out his intent to destroy Judeo-Bolshevism and gain vital space in the Soviet East.
Stalin realized the threat, but far too late. The USSR was catastrophically unprepared for a modern war. The internal purges had taken a devastating toll on the military structure. You have to remember, 20,000 Soviet officers, including highly trained members of the general staff, were shot during the terror.
And their equipment was obsolete.
Their weapons were obsolete, their military doctrine was backward. The source highlights generals like Budiani, who still held this outdated belief that as soon as the war breaks out, everyone will shout, "Change the cavalry."
That's the tragic price of paranoia, isn't it? Eliminating competence for the sake of absolute political loyalty. And to buy time, Stalin signs the August 1939 non-aggression pact with Ribbentrop.
It was an unnatural alliance, but Stalin saw it as purely tactical and deeply cynical. He called it a game about who gets the other one up their sleeve. He correctly calculated that this pact would grant him a crucial reprieve, avoiding war with Germany for a while longer.
But the immediate global consequence was immense.
He gave Hitler the green light to invade Poland a week later, starting World War II.
And when Hitler finally launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, planning to conquer Moscow in weeks, the USSR was caught completely flat-footed.
Stalin had become paranoid about all the wrong threats. He dismissed dozens of intelligence reports and warnings from his generals and spies about the imminent invasion. He feared they were British or German traps designed to trick him into mobilizing too early.
So when a German deserter crossed the border to warn them,
On June 21st, confirming the attack would launch at dawn, Stalin's verdict was simply, shoot him. He literally shot the messenger.
and the immediate defeat was catastrophic beyond imagining.
June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers attacked. Over 1,000 Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground within the first few hours. The military infrastructure just dissolved. Reports detailed immediate chaos. Thousands of our soldiers are wandering aimlessly. Our leaders are leaving. They are leaving us to die.
And behind the walls of the Kremlin?
The sources describe Stalin as being annihilated by the scale of his miscalculation. For the first time, he admitted failure, reportedly saying, "All is lost. We ruined everything."
The sources indicate he retreated into a state of paralysis for 11 days, and when he reemerged, he refused to admit any personal responsibility. Instead, he intensified his cruelty against his own troops.
His immediate response wasn't to rally the troops through inspiration, but through terror. Any soldier who surrendered was branded a traitor, and their families were summarily deported. Most infamously, he established blocking detachments, special units sent to the front lines to shoot on sight any Soviet soldier who showed panic or attempted to retreat.
And this was solidified by Order 227.
His infamous directive. The order's core dictum was, not one step back. It formalized the policy of using fear as a primary motivator, mandating that the Red Army defend every inch of Soviet land to the last drop of blood.
And his strategic blunders continued.
Yes, at Kyiv, Stalin prohibited his generals from evacuating the city. This led directly to the capture of 500,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest mass capture in the history of warfare.
Despite these staggering losses, October 1941 saw a turning point as the German army reached the gates of Moscow.
The capital was subjected to daily bombings, and panic was rampant. There were rumors that Stalin had been arrested or had fled. All his followers urged him to evacuate the capital, and he did briefly take refuge in the subway. But in one of his most decisive acts of courage, or maybe just pure self-preservation, Stalin decided to stay in Moscow.
And that decision was crucial.
It stabilized the political situation and gave the troops, who were now fighting literally on the outskirts of the capital, a galvanizing focus. The November 7th speech on Red Square, delivered in a snowstorm with tanks rolling directly from the parade to the front, became the ultimate symbol of resolve.
But the true strategic turning point came 10 months later in the summer of 1942 at Stalingrad.
Arguably the greatest and most brutal battle of the century. It cost 2 million lives. And here, Stalin finally made a strategic shift. He made the wise decision not to micromanage the battle and instead trusted his chief of staff, General Zhukov, to execute the plan.
And Zhukov's plan was an immense trap.
It was Operation Uranus. Zhukov brilliantly encircled the entire German Sixth Army. The counteroffensive was massive, 1,400 tanks, over 1,000 planes, and 1 million Soviet soldiers. When the battle concluded, 300,000 German soldiers surrendered, including Marshal von Paulus, the first Nazi marshal ever captured alive.
This was the moment.
This was the moment. In the eyes of the world, Stalin became undeniably the first to defeat Adolf Hitler.
And after Stalingrad, he became an unavoidable global player. At the Yalta Conference, the Allies Churchill, Roosevelt, and de Gaulle, they all came to him, recognizing the USSR as the decisive power in Europe.
The geopolitical reality had changed forever. Churchill famously toasted him, saying, "Is there anything more precious than the life of Stalin to each and every one of us?" They had to deal with him as an equal.
So when the Red Army stormed Berlin in 1945,
Stalin demanded a massive geopolitical price. He demanded half of Europe, all the countries his army had liberated, and the Allies, exhausted by war and recognizing his military contribution, they accepted. This was the seed that grew into Soviet control over Eastern Europe for the next half-century.
the victory was monumental, but the domestic cost was crushing.
The cost is staggering. Our sources detail 70,000 Soviet villages annihilated and 26 million Soviet citizens killed. Yet here is the paradox we started with. In the summer of 1945, as soldiers returned home and embraced their families, they weren't revolutionaries. They were exhausted people craving stability.
And for them, the crimes of Stalin.
The purges, the famines, all of that became nothing but old memories. They had peace, and they had a victor to thank.
That collective triumph and deep desire for normalcy allowed the crimes to be instantly rationalized away, even as the Generalissimo arrived in Berlin. This brings us to part 6, the final years and legacy of terror. The victory celebrations of 1945 were staged on this massive scale, yet the man at the center of the triumph was increasingly isolated and frail. The film footage of his masterful arrival in Potsdam, it was pure fiction.
The real Stalin was intensely private. He feared flying, and he hated crowds. That magnificent arrival was played by a body double, a look-alike. The real Stalin took an armored train to Potsdam, mobilizing 5,000 police officers because he was utterly obsessed with the fear of attack.
And his health was failing.
Badly. He suffered from heart attacks and memory lapses, and his profound loneliness just deepened in his final years.
That loneliness was so tragically compounded by the fate of his son, Yakov, who died a prisoner of the Germans.
When Yakov was captured, Hitler proposed trading him for Marshal von Paulus, the general captured at Stalingrad. Stalin refused the trade outright. He saw his role as transcending any personal ties, and he used this brutal political justification.
Why did he say?
What would have said the fathers of the party whose children were made prisoners too? If I had done that, I wouldn't have been called Stalin. It was the ultimate reinforcement of the idea that his identity, the man of steel, was just incompatible with family love.
And his paranoia didn't spare his remaining family. It turned even against Svetlana, his favorite daughter.
His private life was a ruin. His second son, Vasily, was a rapidly collapsing alcoholic aviator. Stalin grew increasingly angry at Svetlana, specifically for her romantic choices. He particularly objected to her dating Jewish men, including the director Alexei Kapler, whom he promptly sent to the Gulag.
So his anti-Semitism grew.
Yes, over the years, the conqueror of Hitler became increasingly anti-Semitic himself, believing the previous generation was contaminated by Zionism.
So immediately after defeating Nazism, Stalin didn't celebrate peace. He relaunched the purges based on his mood and his craziness.
Despite the monumental war losses, the apparatus of terror was immediately rebooted. The Gulag reached its absolute peak, holding 2 million prisoners. The number of Jewish people swept up in these post-war purges increased dramatically, culminating in the early 1950s with the Doctors' Plot, a final terrifying wave of arrests targeting predominantly Jewish doctors. The cycle of fear was back in full force.
And yet, abroad, the fervent worship of Stalin continued, even into his 70th birthday celebration in 1949.
The global denial was persistent. We see French communists like peasants of Grigny sending these handcrafted gifts, convinced that without Stalin's victory at Stalingrad, their village would still have been occupied by Nazis. They thanked him as the man who freed us with his victory. Paul Eluard, the famous French poet, penned glowing verses in his honor.
The juxtaposition between that blind international admiration and the stark reality of his domestic terror is perfectly captured in the anecdote from that 70th birthday celebration.
It is perhaps the cruelest irony of his entire reign. The entire international communist elite, including Mao Zedong, gathered in Moscow. During the lavish ceremony, a 12-year-old girl named Natalia, the daughter of Stalin's trusted secretary Paskrebyshev, read a touching poem to the supreme leader.
And the room cheered.
The room cheered, completely unaware that only a few years earlier, Stalin had personally ordered her own mother shot as an enemy of the people.
By March 1953, the end was approaching. Stalin felt completely indispensable, believing, "What would you do without me? You are blind, the country will fall."
His death on March 4th, 1953, was as solitary as his rule was ruthless. He agonized alone in his room for 2 days after suffering a stroke. His doctors, utterly terrified, were unwilling to risk making a wrong decision or interfering with his care, fearing they would be arrested and shot themselves.
And after passing,
His body was displayed in the Hall of Columns, the very room where he had once convicted and condemned his friends. Officials recited speeches calling him the greatest genius of all mankind.
but away from the cameras and the mandated mourning, his victims had a profoundly different reaction.
In the far north, at the Vorkuta camp, the deportees secretly cheered when they heard the news. They got down on their knees not to mourn, but to pray. May his soul go to hell. They rejoiced that the man with the mustache went to hell.
The final tally.
The final devastating tally of the rate of the man who promised heaven on earth, Yosif Jogashvili, was 20 million deaths.
What an immense and devastating historical deep dive we've just completed. The central contradiction is just inescapable. How a figure who inspired such fervent hope and celebrated such a monumental military victory could simultaneously inflict such calculated internal destruction on his own people.
And the sources really drive home the analytical point. This unlimited brutality could only flourish because of a structural system of lies and manufactured heroism. The lies weren't just for show. They were necessary components of the state's survival.
Right, the propaganda machine.
From the fake numbers promoted by Stakhanov to the wholly staged environments for Harriet's visit, it all created a mandatory parallel reality that allowed both domestic citizens and foreign observers to maintain the essential denial required to ignore the pain and terror happening right beside them.
Okay, let's connect that back to the end of the war. Our source material notes that for the millions of Russian soldiers returning in 1945, the crimes were nothing but old memories. The sheer desire for peace and quiet, coupled with the overwhelming collective triumph over Hitler, was enough to make society immediately rationalize away the atrocities that had occurred just years before. This raises an important question for you, the listener. In times of overwhelming collective triumph or existential threat, how quickly can a society choose to forget or rationalize away the actions of its powerful leaders? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.